I'm Sister Barbara Reed, president of CTU, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to this year's Spring Shapiro Lecture. The Catholic Jewish Studies program at CTU hosts 3 Shapiro Lectures each year, made possible through the generosity of the Shapiro Family Foundation. For many decades, they have enabled CTU to invite world-renowned scholars to speak on a range of topics related to theology, current issues, and culture. For those of you who may be new to CTU, we were founded in 1968 in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, which issued the groundbreaking document Nostra Aetate, the Declaration on the Relation of the Church with Non-Christian Religions. We're celebrating the 60th year since that document was issued. Since our founding, CTU has been very committed to interreligious dialogue, especially through our Catholic Jewish Studies and Catholic Muslim Studies programs. We are grateful for the leadership of Father John Polakowski, who I know is with us online tonight, and Rabbi Chaim Perlmutter of blessed memory, 2 of our founding faculty members who established the Catholic Jewish Studies program and who launched the deep and lasting friendships that have been formed between CTU and our Jewish partners in the last 5+ decades. And we're also very grateful to Dr. Isaac Oliver, who has been coordinating our Catholic Jewish Studies program this academic year. And I'd like to invite him now to introduce our esteemed guest lecturer. Isaac.
Greetings. I hope you can hear me online. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Tzvi Novick, who is Abrams Jewish Thought and Culture Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. Professor Novick completed a BA from Yale University with a degree in philosophy after a very brief but instructive legal career and an MA in Hebrew Bible from Yeshiva University. He enrolled in the PhD program in religious studies at Yale, from which he graduated in 2008 with a focus on early rabbinic Judaism. Professor Novick has taught at Notre Dame ever since on subjects ranging from the Bible to modern Judaism and post-Holocaust literature and theology. He's also a regular contributor to thetorah.com, which I highly recommend. I've read many of his articles and corresponded with him about them, and I really encourage you to see them. Professor Novick is also the author of several books, including most recently, Judaism, A Guide for Christians, which just came out this year. In fact, the title of his presentation today is A Jewish Theology of the Church, a topic that is very apropos, seeing that we are celebrating the 60th anniversary of Vatican II and its landmark declaration Nostra Aetate, but also the 25th anniversary of Dabru Emet, a statement that was released and signed by over 200 Jewish intellectuals and rabbis, encouraging Jews to rethink their relationship about Christianity in a positive way and affirming the relationship between the two. So the topic for this evening is very pertinent and timely. Just as an item of order here, Professor Novick will first deliver his talk. If we have some time at the end, we'll open the floor and the virtual floor for some questions. I'll have a microphone available. Online, please send your questions to one of the co-hosts, to me or to the Bernardine Center. Professor Novick, welcome back to CTU. This is a space very familiar to you since you have participated and organized many endeavors here on Jewish-Christian relations. CTU is very fortunate to have you back. The stage is yours.
I'm conscious of living in a moment in which the ground is shifting under our feet in multiple directions. Nostra Aetate has been mentioned, the Church's declaration on non-Christian religions, which marked a sea change in the relationship between the Catholic Church and the Jewish people, was issued, as mentioned, 60 years ago in 1965. This was less than a couple of decades after the consolidation of the liberal world order following the Second World War. We are in a different world today. The ideology of liberalism, having endured in different iterations for many decades, is now tottering in its way, pressed from both sides by ideologies that reject its principles and have no patience for its compromises. Closer to our immediate concern this evening, Nostra Aetate emerged in a world just beginning to grapple with the Holocaust and just before the Six-Day War that would utterly transform the state of Israel. Now, almost all Holocaust survivors have passed from the earth, and the world's perception of Israel, the character of the state, the nature of the challenges that it faces, all of these are dramatically different from what they were in 1965. It's a scary, uncertain moment for the world. It's an anxious moment for Jewish-Catholic relations. And in such a situation, it's a bit difficult to speak, right? How do I speak when shared consensus is breaking down in certain respects, when one can't be certain what one's audience thinks, when I don't quite know what I myself think? But perhaps this is helpful. Perhaps we've always assumed too much, taken too much for granted, left too much unsaid these past 60 years. As Dr. Oliver mentioned, I wrote a book recently that doesn't explicitly acknowledge these anxieties, or to put the point differently, I wrote a book that reflects the apex of the trajectory marked out by Nostra Aetate, as though to say, here is what we have, here's the relationship that has been built, here is the way a Christian who perceives herself to be in such a relationship with the Jewish people might approach Judaism. Will this relationship endure? Will it grow and develop? Will we rather turn back the clock or shift in a different direction altogether? That's a choice that individuals and groups will make for themselves, but the book describes what that relationship is and its ground so that we'll have a clear sense of what's at stake. I want to get to the topic that I chose for this talk, a Jewish theology of the church. I'm not sure that it's altogether well-timed for this anxious moment. It maybe assumes too much, maybe courts controversy at a moment when we might better seek commonality. But I will broach it nonetheless. But maybe I'll just begin briefly by describing the book project and then get to that specific topic. The book supposes that a Christian approaching Judaism should know two sets of things. And I guess, yeah, I'll just put out the request if we can get some way of getting the PowerPoint on. Now would be a good point to get it started. So the book supposes that a Christian approaching Judaism should know two sets of things. The first is the history of Christian teaching about Judaism, or in other words, how Christianity has understood the Jewish people and Judaism, and how the church has understood itself in relation to them from antiquity forward. The end point of this narrative is that the Catholic Church today perceives itself to be in a distinctively close relationship to the Jewish people because God, the God whom Christians worship, is in relation to the Jewish people because God's covenant with Israel, God's gifts and calling to them endure irrevocably. This commitment motivates the second part of the book, which concerns the second thing that a Christian approaching Judaism ought to know, namely Judaism. Of course, Judaism, like any age-old religion, is a topic that should interest everyone. But if Christians perceive themselves to be fellow travelers with the Jewish people, if they understand God to be in relation to them in a distinctive way, bound up with the church's own relationship to God, then they ought to be especially interested in how the Jewish people have thought about and think about God and themselves and the world. Thus, the two topics of the book, the history of Christian and especially Catholic thought about Judaism, and then an introduction to Jewish theology with comparison to Christian and especially Catholic theology. And I don't know of another single book that works through both of these topics together in a synergistic way. So I hope I've made a contribution in this respect, in addition to whatever specific new insights I've hit upon along the way. The book is called Judaism, A Guide for Christians. I didn't choose that title. I think the title is a little bit presumptuous. That was the publisher's choice. My choice was The Natural Branches, which is an allusion to one of the ways Paul speaks about the Jewish people in the Epistle to the Romans. The publisher thought that title a bit too obscure. This project is fundamentally an exercise in the comparison of collective bodies in Judaism and Christianity. The subfield of Christianity, of Christian theology that bears most immediately on this topic is ecclesiology. ecclesiology concerning the nature of the church, of course, but the nature of the church can't be considered apart from the nature and status of other collective bodies, first and foremost the people Israel and the Gentiles. And that's on the Christian side. And then on the Jewish side of things, my interest is in broadly Israel, the people Israel, and the Gentiles. So what is the purpose of comparison, of thinking about the church in relation to the Jewish people, and thinking about a Jewish theology of the church in relation to how the church thinks about itself? How should comparison be undertaken? And I want to return to Nostra Aetate. I really want to frame my project to some extent as kind of a Jewish Nostra Aetate. So Dr. Oliver referred to Dabru Emet, which could be considered a first such attempt. And this is another one bearing specifically on the question of the church. Nostra Aetate, what is the purpose of comparison in Nostra Aetate? In this document, the church seeks out things that it finds familiar in the beliefs and practices of other religious communities, on the assumption, never stated explicitly, but close to the surface throughout, that such familiar things represent grounds for a familiar or familial relationship with those communities. And Nostra Aetate, as is well known, is structured by a narrative logic that runs from the distant to the proximate. It begins with the religious instinct of humankind as such in section 1, and turns from there to the religious systems emerging from particular peoples. In section 2, Hinduism and Buddhism are named, and you have section 2 over here about how in Hinduism, men contemplate the divine mystery and express it through an inexhaustible abundance of myths, etc. They seek freedom from the anguish of our human condition, either through ascetical practices or profound meditation, or a flight to God with love and trust, and so forth. And from there, it proceeds to the Muslims, as it puts it, or to the faith of Islam. And from there, in section 4, to the Jewish people. As the document progresses, I'll take it backward to section 2 over here. As the document progresses, the objects and methods of comparison change and become ever more complex, though the changes and the complexity are never quite acknowledged. At the beginning, in sections 1 and 2, the church takes up comparans from which it's genealogically distinct, right, with which it has no common origins, Hinduism and Buddhism. It seeks out in them ideas and practices that resemble its own. The idea that the human condition is marked by anguish, for example, or the practice of asceticism. As the document turns to Islam, and here is section 3, where it turns to Islam, it persists in this mode of conceptual comparison, singling out, among other things, the fact that Islam anticipates a final day of judgment, values the moral life, and prescribes prayer and fasting. And I've switched the order here of the discussion of Islam in order to emphasize, to make a point. So it continues when it gets to Islam with conceptual comparison. What kind of concepts do we have in common with this other religion? But with Islam, the document also introduces another set of commonalities, not abstract concepts defined by generic properties, but concrete entities with proper names and genealogies. Abraham, Jesus, Mary, right? And that's the second paragraph over here. Nostra Aetate doesn't, here, right, with this turn from concepts, abstract concepts to concrete entities, the mechanism of comparison becomes quite a bit more fraught. Right? Nostra Aetate doesn't wish to claim that Christianity and Islam share a notion of Jesus. Jesus is not a notion, but a person. Because Jesus is a specific notion, a specific person, rather, I'm sorry, with a specific concrete background, there are right or wrong things that can be said about Jesus. And in fact, according to Nostra Aetate, Islam does not get Jesus altogether right. Muslims do not acknowledge Jesus as God, as the document says, but they do revere him as a prophet, and such reverence counts as a reason for friendship. Left unstated, but following from the explicit acknowledgement of what the church deems Islam's error in its understanding of Jesus, is that this error can be a source of friction, something that would be unnatural in the case of conceptual comparison, our ideas of asceticism, their ideas of asceticism, that sort of thing. The document can judge Islam's understanding of Jesus in this way because implicitly the church claims ownership, as it were, over Jesus, not surprisingly. Ownership, obviously, in a sense of belonging to our conceptual sphere. To put the point generally, Nostra Aetate focuses on entities that it conceives relative to Islam as belonging to the church. Abraham, Jesus, Mary. Islam, quote unquote, takes pleasure, that's the language of the document, in adopting these entities into its religious system, but their origins, from the perspective of the document, lie in Christianity. Now, when Nostra Aetate turns to Judaism in section 4, the mechanism of comparison via abstract concepts, right? You have your asceticism, we have asceticism, you have prayer, we have prayer. That drops out entirely, right? The document doesn't, for example, praise Judaism for preaching the moral life or legislating prayer. Rather, comparison occurs entirely in terms of these concrete entities, or in terms of a genealogical comparison. But the logic of genealogical comparison of concrete entities, is different from that in section 3 on Islam, because the document doesn't profess to own any genealogical entities relative to Judaism. Or to put the point differently, Nostra Aetate does not recognize Judaism as a distinct religious system that might borrow from Christianity, or from which Christianity might borrow. And in fact, the word Judaism does not occur in Nostra Aetate. Islam occurs, Buddhism occurs, Hinduism, but not the word Judaism. From the perspective of Nostra Aetate, the Jewish people are not surrounded by a conceptual framework, Judaism, that separates them from the conceptual framework within which the church exists. The church relates to the Jewish people directly. And for this reason, one can hardly even speak at this point of comparison in a straightforward sense. So that's Nostra Aetate. Now I'm thinking about a Jewish Nostra Aetate, right? So here you have over here, right, on the left, Nostra Aetate has conceptual comparison of abstract entities, and it undertakes that in relation to Hinduism, to Buddhism, and to Islam. And then it also has genealogical comparison of concrete entities located in the world. And it does that with Islam. But when it comes to Islam, Islam belongs to a separate conceptual sphere, which is why it has the name Islam. And the entities that it finds in Islam are those that it claims as its own: Abraham, Mary, Jesus. And then when it turns to Judaism, it's again dealing with concrete entities: Abraham's stock, right, the Jewish people, and with the whole salvation history, the crucifixion. But in this case, there's no distinction between Christianity and Judaism. There's no word Judaism. Rather, it's a single conceptual sphere. If we're looking at a Jewish Nostra Aetate, I forgot, I meant to sort of think about what how we might render it. I mean, we wouldn't want a direct rendering of the Latin into Hebrew, but some equivalent title, catchy title for the Declaration on the Relation of Israel to Non-Jewish Religions. But Christianity in such a document would figure by default roughly the same way that Islam figures in Nostra Aetate, as a religious system that is distinct from Judaism, but that contains many entities that Judaism claims as its own. And my aim here is to sketch what such a treatment of Christianity and of the church might look like, not in general, but specifically with an interest in collective bodies. And we can actually, it's possible to treat collective bodies as a concept, right? It's not something that Nostra Aetate does, but it could have. It could have taken up collectivity itself as a concept that might offer grounds for comparison and thus fellowship. It doesn't, for example, note that among the notions and practices that Islam has in common with Christianity is the organization of the believers into a collective body, in its case, the Ummah. A conceptual comparison of collectivity between Judaism and Christianity would lead us to ask, perhaps first and foremost, how is the concept of Israel in Judaism similar to or different from the concept of the church in Christianity? A lot of very interesting questions to ask about that, right? The church is constituted in the first place through its relationship with God, whereas Israel exists as a collective prior to, in a certain sense, its relationship with God. So there are interesting questions to ask about the way the church is a collective in comparison with Israel as a collective, but that's to think about collectivities from a conceptual perspective. But I'm looking at concrete entities, and I'm comparing the relationship of the Jewish people to the church in Catholicism to the relationship of the Jewish people to the Gentiles in Judaism, right? And I want to make the following claim, right? That in the Catholic Church today, in the wake of Vatican II, the Jewish people and the church and their relationship to each other are conceptualized in ways very similar to those in which Judaism, traditionally, and even more so today, conceives of the Jewish people and the Gentiles and their relationship with each other, right? So that there's a very important fundamental similarity here between Catholicism in the way in which it conceives the relationship between the Jewish people and the church, and Judaism in the way in which it conceives the relationship between the Jewish people and the Gentiles. So I want to start with the church and then turn to Judaism. And so I want to begin clarifying the church's concept of itself. That's a pretty big topic. We're not going to cover all of that, but some key points. The theological energies unleashed by Vatican II have sometimes pulled the Catholic Church in competing directions. Contemporary church historian Massimo Fagioli recently noted one such instance. Here is what he says, and this is on the PowerPoint: in an increasingly global and post-European church, Gaudium et Spes and its emphasis on social justice and the common good has been received more deeply than Nostra Aetate, paragraph 4, on the Jewish people. Global Catholicism relativizes the centrality of Jewish-Christian dialogue. That's a very interesting observation, or claim, anyhow. We can unpack Fagioli's diagnosis as follows. On the one hand, Vatican II marks a dramatic rapprochement between the church and the Jewish people, as signaled first and foremost by Nostra Aetate, paragraph 4. On the other hand, the church through Vatican II commits itself to the promotion of universal human goods. That's also a substantial change with Vatican II. In the words of Gaudium et Spes, the church, quote, proclaims the rights of man. She acknowledges and greatly esteems the dynamic movements of today by which these rights are everywhere fostered. And it's easy to see how these different vectors of commitment, one outward, as it were, toward the world, and one inward toward the Jewish people, could come into conflict at the practical level. The church might devote more resources or attention in one direction rather than the other, or it might fail to appreciate how, in a particular circumstance, engagement with the one might complicate its engagement with the other. And these remarks that you have here on the PowerPoint emerge from such a case, and I won't get into that case. But is there an intrinsic tension between these commitments at the level of principle? And I want to look at Karl Rahner's schema. This is from a 1979 lecture, his fundamental theological interpretation of Vatican II. According to Rahner, we can discern retrospectively from Vatican II, and with due recognition of oversimplifications, 3 epochs in the history of the church. The first is, quote, the short period of Jewish Christianity, or a church of the Jews. The second, inaugurated at least retrospectively in hindsight with Paul, is the long era in which the church operated within the particular cultural sphere defined, as it were, by Athens and Rome, or what Rahner labels Hellenism and European culture and civilization. This second epoch he calls the period of Gentile Christianity, or a church of the Gentiles. And then in the third period, made visible by Vatican II, though with earlier roots, the church becomes, or is in the process of becoming, a world church. Not a Western church exported to the world, but a church that emerges organically and indigenously from the proclaiming of the gospel in a wide range of distinct cultural circumstances. So what is the, as it were, genitive of the church of, in what Rahner calls the third stage, right? If the church is of the Jews in the first stage and of the Gentiles in the second, then it is of whom in the third? The superficial answer to this question, the answer that is in a certain sense encouraged by Rahner's trajectory, which supposes a kind of ever-expanding locus for the church's action, is humanity, right? The church of humanity. This answer could find support in the fact that Rahner cites Gaudium et Spes approvingly for the way in which in it, the church as a totality, quote, becomes conscious of its responsibility for the dawning history of humanity. And likewise, when he quotes Nostra Aetate, is to praise specifically its, quote, truly positive evaluation of the great world religions. But this characterization of Nostra Aetate is insufficiently dialectical because it misses the concentric structure of this document that directs the church inward from mankind as a whole to Eastern religions, to Islam, and finally to the Jewish people. Humanity also doesn't capture as a category the variety among cultures that's critical to the notion of a world church as described by Rahner. And so I think a better way forward, would be to modify Rahner's schema, is to return to that second epoch, the point, according to Rahner, when Jewish Christianity becomes Gentile Christianity. Now, this description is precise at a sociological level because the church in the first centuries of the Common Era rapidly transformed from a community whose membership and leadership were almost entirely Jewish to one in which they were not. But the term Gentile belongs, in the first place, not to sociology, but to the divine economy of the Bible. The category Gentile signifies the nations other than Israel. From this perspective, for the church to be Gentile is for it to recognize itself as constituted by the nations other than Israel. But a supersessionist church, right, a church that is, and we haven't introduced the term supersessionist, but we can talk about a supersessionist church as a church committed, as it generally was prior to Vatican II, to the notion that the church is the new people of God that replaces Israel as the people of God. A supersessionist church can't, in fact, define itself as Gentile because it doesn't exist in relation to Israel. The category Gentile structurally pairs with Israel. The default self-conceptualization of the supersessionist church is actually thus universalist. It's the church of human beings as such, or of humanity. So the genitive of humanity is thus properly assigned to the second epoch and not the third. The third epoch with Vatican II entails recognition of the persistence of God's relationship with Israel. This is this fundamental break with supersessionist teaching that comes with Vatican II, the recognition of the perseverance of God's covenantal relationship with the people Israel. It's only at this point then that the church becomes not only sociologically, but theologically Gentile. Or more precisely, it finds itself at this point confronted with a choice. Having rejected supersessionism, the church recognizes that in its ideal form, the church should be composed of Jew and Gentile, right? In the words of Lumen Gentium, a people made up of Jew and Gentile, making them one, not according to the flesh, but in the spirit. Or in the words of the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews, it is and remains a qualitative definition of the Church of the New Covenant that it consists of Jews and Gentiles, even if the quantitative proportions of Jewish and Gentile Christians may initially give a different impression. So what does such a church look like? One possibility is for this post-supersessionist church to welcome Jews into the church as Jews, under conditions that enable them to live and persist as Jews. The other possibility is to recognize what would those conditions be, presumably, I don't know, continued observance of the law, of the ritual law within the church for converts, Jewish converts to Christianity, some kind of understanding that Jewish converts to Christianity will marry fellow Jews, but the persistence of some kind of Jewish community within the church. The other option is to recognize that the church, as it is now constituted, cannot foster within itself a living, self-propagating community of Jewish Christians, and that it therefore should not missionize to Jews. And that's basically where the church seems to have fallen out. The Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews, in the same document that I quoted, in fact renounces the idea of an institutional mission to the Jews, counseling instead that Christians bear witness to their faith in Christ, but not missionize. The implication of this position is that the church recognizes itself in its present instantiation as consisting specifically of Gentiles and not of Jews, except in an incidental way. The church looks forward to a future horizon in which it constitutes in itself the union of Jew and Gentile in Christ, but now, as the church of the Gentiles alone, it circumscribes itself in relation to this ideal. So if the church's rapprochement with the Jewish people in Vatican II becomes manifest in ecclesiological terms in the form of a self-consciously Gentile church, right? So Gentile church is actually the church of Vatican II and not the church of the medieval and early modern periods. How should this development be understood in relation to the other earlier mentioned landmark development signaled by Vatican II, namely the emergence of a world church? It can't be said, I think, that there's a necessary connection between these two ecclesiological transformations, especially because the church hasn't, in fact, even after Vatican II, tended to forefront its specifically Gentile character in its self-understanding. Nevertheless, there's a certain synergy that emerges between Gentile church and world church when we recognize that within the framework of a world church, mission becomes, in the words of Pope Francis, a means by which, quote, in the Christian customs of an evangelized people, the Holy Spirit adorns the church, showing her new aspects of revelation and giving her a new face. So if the ultimate achievement of mission in the supersessionist pre-modern church was the conversion of the Jews, right, the erasure of the most stubborn remainder standing in the path of a universal, but in fact, as Ronner notes, Western church, then the Gentile church of the third epoch can construe the stable differentiation between Jew and Gentile as a sign of the internal differentiation among Gentiles, which must be given theological expression through mission as inculturation. And we can call the church, so conceived, the Gentile world church. And that's the title that I give it there. So that's kind of thinking about the church's self-understanding, or one way to approach the church's self-understanding in the wake of Vatican II. So from there now I want to turn to, right, because the point over here is to argue for a fundamental structural similarity between the way in which the church conceives, the post-supersessionist, post-conciliar, post-Vatican II church conceives of the relationship between the Jewish people and the Gentiles, on the one hand, and the way in which Judaism conceives of the relationship between the Jewish people and the Gentiles. So now I want to turn to Judaism. The conceptualization of Gentiles in Jewish theology was the subject of a recent book by Adi Ophir and Ishai Rosentzvi. They argue that in the rabbinic corpus, the goy, right, that's the term for the non-Jew, the goy is a pure negation, the non-Jew. Right, non-Jew. That's the entirety of the meaning, as it were, the significance of the goy. The rabbis don't assign a particular character to the goy, nor in general do they assign him agency. Likewise, they deny the goy a collective existence or collective forms of existence. The goy is an individual, one whose significance lies entirely in supporting the Jew, non-Jew binary. The authors of this book, Rosentzvi and Ophir, they acknowledge that this characterization is true first and foremost for the discourse of rabbinic law, halacha, while non-halachic discourse, agadah or midrash, offers a somewhat different portrait. But they ultimately take the view that, quote, midrash should be understood as complementing the halachic conception of the Gentile and not undermining it. So I want to take issue with that and argue that there is, in fact, a meaningful distinction between these discourses. This individual kind of characterless goy that Ophir and Rosentzvi discern is really proper to halachic discourse. And the features of the halachic goy owe much to, are even decisively determined by, the character of halacha as law. And law is not very interested in character. It has problems processing collectives. It's interested in individuals, and it doesn't attend much to their character. And in fact, these features of law are also felt in the characterization of the Jew in halachic discourses, who tends to be an individual Jew rather than a people. The people Israel doesn't function much within halachic discourse. That needs to be qualified in a lot of ways. But in Agadah, by contrast, the predominant figure on the Jewish side of the ledger is not the individual Jew, but the collective people Israel. And the counterpart of the people Israel is not the goy, but the nations of the world, umot ha'olam, or sometimes simply the nations, umot, who are also a collective. More precisely, the nations of the world are a collective of collectives, a group of nations. Ophir and now I'll just skip a little bit because I'm attentive to our time. It is true that even in Agadah, even in kind of non-legal passages in rabbinic literature, the nations of the world are sketched dimly in two senses. First, they're generally treated as a single, undifferentiated group. And second, they're generally defined by their hostility to Israel. But they aren't always hostile, nor even are they always undifferentiated. And I want to just look at two sources about the nations of the world from rabbinic literature. These are two of the first three sources from Genesis Rabbah, which is the rabbinic commentary from the roughly 4th century of the Common Era on the book of Genesis. So here's the first source. Rabbi Joshua of Sichnin, in the name of Rabbi Levi, expounded, he has shown the people the power of his works in giving them the heritage of nations, goyim, in Psalm 111:6. Why did the Holy One, blessed be he, reveal to Israel what he created on the first day and on the second day and on the third? On account of the nations of the world, that they not aggravate Israel and say to them, you are a nation of plunderers, because you took the land of Israel from the Canaanites. Israel can answer them, is it not plunder in your own hands? Because we have in Deuteronomy 2:23, the Avim lived in the settlements in the vicinity of Gaza, and then the Kaftorim, who came from Kaftor, destroyed them and settled in their place. The world in all its fullness belongs to the Holy One, blessed be he. When he wished, he gave it to you, and when he wished, he took it from you and gave it to us. This is the force of what is written in giving them the heritage of nations, right? So that's how this verse is read. He has shown the people the power of his works, meaning God taught them the book of Genesis and the story of God's creation of the world in order to justify giving them the heritage of nations in order to justify the idea of the assignment of lands or the reassignment of lands to different people. A text that obviously has a lot of resonance nowadays, and one could dwell on this for quite a while. But really, what's of importance to me, and this is again the first instance of the category nations of the world in Genesis Rabbah, is that the nations are treated here as hostile to Israel. Right? They accuse them of being plunderers, and they are treated as a collective. They speak as a group. But Deuteronomy 2:23, or more broadly, this whole passage in Deuteronomy describes various nations going this way and that way. And so even as the text does describe the nations of the world as a collective, it's acknowledging the idea that they are a collective of collectives. They do form a single collective insofar as they stand over against Israel, but this doesn't preclude the existence of internal differentiation. So that's a rather dark text with a lot of controversy. Here's a lighter tone. This is the third instance of the nations of the world in Genesis Rabbah, and it's talking about the rain. And the greatness of rain compares the rain to the resurrection of the dead. And it's a comparison that we find in the New Testament itself in terms of the seed, right, that decays underground and then is resurrected, as it were, through rain. Said Rabbi Chia, son of Ba, the rain, is greater than the resurrection of the dead. For the resurrection of the dead is for human beings, while this, meaning the rain, is for human beings and animals. For the resurrection of the dead is for Israel, while this rain is for the nations of the world and for Israel. A goy, right, this is the term that's used for an individual non-Jew, in these texts, asked Rabbi Joshua, son of Korcha, as follows: You have your festivals and we have our festivals. When you are joyful, we are not joyful. And when we are joyful, you are not joyful. And when are we and you joyful? Tomorrow, when the rain falls. Right? So the rain is a shared day of festivity. And so this text also sets the nations of Israel, the nations of the world against Israel, as it were. And it says the resurrection of the dead is only for Israel, presumably because as a group in any case, the understanding here, similar understanding from what one finds in Paul in the New Testament, is that the Gentiles are in general sinful, they're pagan, and so they, as a group, will not merit resurrection of the dead, while Israel will. But even as it sets Israel in tension with the nations of the world, it also acknowledges the idea of commonality, a shared interest, a shared joy in the rain, a shared participation in the life of this world. And we can say then that in the rabbinic canon, diversity is suppressed, the nation's character is markedly negative, but especially in light of gestures to the contrary in the rabbinic corpus itself, which I pointed out, it's reasonable to construe these prevailing features of the rabbis' nations of the world as incidental rather than essential. And many voices from medieval to contemporary Jewish theology that express tolerance toward or even embrace other religions, in fact, do so by insisting on the diversity of peoples. I'll mention Rabbi Joseph Albo, circa 1400, who contends that divine religion must be multiple, not because of any variation in the giver, in God, but because of variation in the recipients. He says human temperaments vary. People are also different based on where they live, because the nature of lands differs based on the air, mountains, waters, and the like. Or you have Rabbi Abraham Isaac HaKohen Cook, 1865 to 1935, saying, the pathways to morality and means of acquiring good character, which are rooted in fear of heaven, differ by nation, based on historical circumstance, race, land, and material and spiritual experiences. What impresses the splendor of the divine light and the glory of heaven upon one nation does not upon another. So the acknowledgement by Albo, by Rabbi Cook and others, of the internal differences among peoples or among the nations of the world, even as it is meant to ground tolerance of other religions, interestingly, can't quite account for Christianity and Islam as traditionally conceived, which don't imagine themselves as instantiating the genius of a particular people. And yet, at the comparative level, which is the important point for my purposes, there's an important similarity between the nations of the world, imagined from this perspective from the perspective of this strain of Jewish theology, as the site for the variable reception of the divine light according to national character. There's an important similarity between them and the Gentile world church imagined from the perspective of Christian theology as the framework within which the gospel finds variable expression across different cultures. And so a Jewish Nostra Aetate could have the following thing to say about post-conciliar Catholicism on the matter of collective bodies. We as Jews find in the stable complementary relationship within Christianity between the Jewish people and the Gentile world church a striking echo of Judaism's own conception of the stable complementary relationship between the Jewish people and the nations of the world. And that similarity, that fundamental similarity, is an important foundation, an important basis for fellowship and for a sense of shared purpose. Now, a Jewish theologian might go further and attempt to treat the church not in the way that the church treats Islam in Nostra Aetate, but in the way that it treats Judaism, right? This is to get us back to this earlier slide about these mechanisms of comparison. I've been thinking about how Judaism could think about Christianity and the church in the way that Christianity thinks about Islam in Nostra Aetate, as a distinct religious conceptual world that includes elements that Christianity claims as its own. Likewise, Judaism can conceive of Christianity as a distinct conceptual world that claims as its own things that Judaism recognizes as originating in its own conceptual world. And from that perspective, you'd get a formulation like this, the one that I just mentioned. But one could go further. A Jewish theology could attempt to treat the church in the way that the church treats Judaism in Nostra Aetate. That is to say, a Jewish theologian might find a place for the church as such within Judaism. This step would necessarily involve conceptualizing the church differently from the way the church conceptualizes itself, because the church takes itself to be in relation to Jesus as Messiah and God, while for Judaism, Jesus is neither God nor the Messiah. But this sort of intentional misconstrual could nevertheless be productive, so long as it's undertaken consciously and in good faith. So, for example, Eugene Korn suggests that Jews today might envision Christians as participating in God's covenantal relationship with Israel. In my book, I suggest that the church might be conceived from the perspective of Judaism as a community of resident aliens, gerei toshav, right? So the Bible recognizes a category of resident alien, an individual who lives within the Jewish community in the land of Israel, but is not him or herself genealogically Jewish, and therefore, right, is owed assistance. One is supposed to love the resident alien and be considerate and attentiveness to them, to recognize Israel's own past as resident aliens within Egypt. And so Jewish theology might conceive of the church as a community of resident aliens, insofar as Christians have chosen to attach themselves to a people not their own, and to take as their scripture a set of works written in the language of that people and centered on that people. So those are ways of going further. But the main claim I've tried to work out over here, and with this I'll stop, is that Jewish theology need not integrate the church in this way in order to recognize and cherish the remarkable parallel between, on the one hand, the way in which a post-supersessionist Catholicism, or at least a certain interpretation of it, conceives of the relationship between the Jewish people and the church, the Gentile world church, on the one hand, and on the other, the way in which Judaism understands the relationship between the Jewish people and the nations of the world. Thank you.